My guest for this episode is Shishkin, the CEO of Informed, a minimalist news concierge service. This is an extremely interesting conversation that will continue. So consider this episode 1 of a multi-part series. I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. This is interesting. Tell me a little bit about what led you to want to reach out and what it is that you're interested in discussing.
Totally, and thank you, Noah, for having me. I'm glad that Leah connected us and found the match. We've been listening to your episode for your podcast for some time, and I like the kind of this corner of the internet where you are able to share unusual thoughts and things that aren't things that people usually think about or even come to mind, but everything from the apocalyptic game theory that you were talking about, to the light cone. It's really nice to just hear new, refreshing perspectives and well-articulated thought on life. And so I thought there may be a good partnership there. And so super excited to join you in conversation. And with the sort of subject matter that Leah was discussing with you and potentially want to explore together is this great sort of conspiracy, but also just the economic reality of the news media industry today that leads us to not really have a lot of options as everyday people. Don't really have a lot of options for getting pure information. Everywhere we go, we get information that is tinted with some sort of bias, some sort of solicitation, some sort of advertisement. And that's the least of it. You can get a lot more nefarious, reaching all the way up to propaganda, as we've seen in Russia, we've seen in all over the world, especially recently. And so it just sort of underscores the importance of having an information diet that is pure, that is non-toxic, and is not full of solicitations and promises and advertisements that take away from the factuality of things, where sometimes you just need to know the facts of the world that you inhabit. And so that's what we do with our project. That's what we stand for. And I was keen to talk to you about the problem and about our solution, but also anything else that may come to mind, anywhere in between.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the kind words. I really appreciate that. It's rare to get much feedback on this kind of activity, so it's really good to hear that people are finding it of some value. Well, you said that I like to to focus on ideas that are not typically considered. So the first thing that comes to mind is whether or not this is really that different of an information landscape from any other period in time. Certainly, if we look into ancient history, the information available to people would be relatively limited when it comes to a broader world. They would have an intimate understanding of the natural world in which they were living. That is something that we have lost to a large extent. But if there was any information about the larger world, quite often it would be something that was defined by, let's say, the cultural priests in one way or another, right? And as civilizations developed, I think that information was always mediated through, let's say, the priest class. And you could say that now we have a kind of media priest class who have been installed to facilitate the objectives of the people who have the most power. Right, and that is what would be necessary within any kind of a civilization. I'm just trying to paint a relatively neutral picture here. We can say, okay, well, there are good and bad things about this, but if you're going to have a civilization, that civilization requires that there be a kind of uniformity of behavior in some way or another. At least within certain groups, there has to be agreement. Now, we might wonder why it is that our media landscape seems to be so intent on turning people against each other right now. And, one way of interpreting that would be to say that, well, actually, at this point in time, the masters of the universe really don't have any national loyalties. They have a kind of global management perspective on things. And when they see something that they think of as being not really fulfilling their objectives, they might be more interested in seeing that thing dismantled. So there does appear to be, in some respects, a concerted effort to dismantle certain, you could say maybe the West in general. That there's a lot of internal friction, a lot of disagreement, a lot of unnecessary cultivated antagonisms happening within the West. And so we might think, I think, with some good reason, well, this suggests that, global management doesn't have an interest in investing in the future in the West. Maybe that's wrong, I think, but if you take a look at it just from like a raw numbers perspective, the West is more expensive than anywhere else. It's a lot more expensive to hire labor. You don't have access to the resources that you would have elsewhere around the planet. Elsewhere around the planet, labor is relatively cheap, and the resources are relatively easy to exploit. So from the point of view of a global technocratic system, the West is just unnecessary expenditure.
Yeah. And I hear everything you're saying, and I really want to focus on almost like the infrastructure of media that has brought us to a place where any of these manipulations and sways are possible in the first place, because we have limited capacity to really speculate and explore the why and the how and who exactly is doing it. But I want to sort of, offer something that I've been studying for some time and, run through the Informed company, is just the infrastructure for, truth-based, factual, objective media has become extremely broken. And I think it feeds into some of the narrative that you were describing. But generally, I don't know a lot of people who still trust news or still trust information media as a category. There's a real sense of resignation from consuming news. We see this in polls. The AP NORC poll just released last week showed that 65% of U.S. adults want to reduce their consumption of news in politics. Something like 51% in anything that's related to economics and jobs. 40%, roughly 4 out of 10, want to reduce their consumption of anything climate related. So there's a real sort of resignation of the public reading news, consuming information, not entertainment. There's no shortage of that, but really information, like factual media. And I am led to think is like, how do we get here? How do we get to a place where there's, certainly there's a good amount of self-radicalization that you were hinting at as well. But before that, there's even a self-disenfranchisement, of giving up the access to the building blocks of opinion, such that you become easily vulnerable, easily swayed by other people's opinions, because you don't really have your own, because you haven't built your own. Because to build your own, you need facts and conviction. And you haven't taken the time to do it because you stopped reading news. You stopped consuming information media. You consume entertainment media and social media, but you no longer consume information media because it's, information overload, because it's, causing you fatigue, and because it's like so frustrating, it's making you upset and sometimes maybe powerless. So what are the causes that brought about this industry that is meant to give people power, enfranchise people through informing them? What's happened that it's caused it to sort of decline into being there and being so loud and clear to everybody, but not actually serving the purpose that it has, where nobody trusts news media anymore, and the vast majority of people, I want to say like maybe 80% of any group, are not really consuming news anymore. And I have certain sort of theses behind this, what happened. But I want to just pause here and posit that sort of exploration to you, and ask you if you can hear me well with this microphone change.
I can hear you okay. Yeah, it's still a little muffled, but it's not bad.
Well, that's weird.
I think people should be able to hear okay. So yeah, I think this is a multifactorial situation. Democracy is annoying for a global management system. So particularly in complex technological societies where it takes a fair amount of expertise in order to function optimally in different domains. It's extraordinarily difficult to educate a person even within one field to a point of expertise. And so the understanding of what is necessary is something which is hard won. You have to actually work relatively hard in order to understand what's happening. There's a lot of different moving parts and there's a lot of different integrations, right? And so on some level, you could say that within the political domain, people are really ill-equipped to understand what's happening. And people have had generations of experience now where they realize that the ability for the democratic process to produce the kinds of changes that people want is really, very limited if there really is any actual progress along those lines. So, for a long time they were talking about the successes of the social revolutions producing something like the 40-hour work week. And now how many people are working more than 40 hours in order to make their way in this world? So that was considered a success, but even within a few decades, there's a lot of people who don't get to enjoy that success. And even people who are working a 40-hour work week, that's a significant chunk of time. They're seeing that they're rewarded less, that the money that they make for that effort goes much less of a distance than it used to. But let's keep in mind now that from the perspective of global management, which is, I'm not like defending that perspective, I'm just saying this is what I kind of think is happening. From the perspective of global management, even the people who are making less now on their 40-hour work week are making a lot more than much of the rest of the world. And so they see it as, efficiency, cheap labor, the West is a burden, So that's the kind of, that's a hypothesis about what's going on, because as you said before, I think quite correctly, there's no way for us to really know with any real certainty who or precisely what or why. But nevertheless, this does provide kind of a framework that we can think about it in that makes things make sense. Because when you're looking at it just from the point of view of what we were raised with to expect as part of this system, none of it makes any sense. Right? Why would you have a media that's constantly lying to people? Right? Why would there be so little effort to try to convey meaningful information to people? Well, this is a framework that gives you an idea as to why this is happening. And I think we can take it another level deeper. We can talk about this in terms of evolutionary development. So if you think about, this is one of the themes that I have on my podcast, that as far as I can tell, not a lot of people are very interested in thinking of it this way. But nevertheless, to me, it makes a lot of sense to think, well, we are still part of this natural system, and evolutionary forces are still at play, right? And in the ancient prehistory of evolution, we obviously had the development of organisms that were incredibly complex, much in the same way that our civilizations are complex. And they had to negotiate cooperation between entities which were not necessarily predisposed to cooperate. You know what I'm saying? And so what we're seeing now, I think, and a lot of this has to do with population, because there's one of the interesting things that's observed in network science is that the characteristics of a network have a lot to do with the number of nodes within it. So the more nodes, the more the system is necessarily going to take on certain characteristics. So when you have a very large human population to manage, it's like, well, the management of that population kind of overrides all of the ideological considerations. You know, we had a lot of very beautiful ideas about how society should be organized, but when push comes to shove, you still have to provide the nutrients for the population. You have to get rid of the waste. You have to maintain all the various systems, and that kind of takes precedence. It's sort of like we all have a lot of wonderful ideas about how we want our life to be, but nevertheless, we have to keep cleaning the kitchen. You know what I mean? All of this stuff that has to happen. If you can't afford to get someone else to do it, you're going to have to do it yourself. And basically the same principles apply to our civilization. I think that we're kind of being forced by evolutionary pressures to abandon a lot of the principles that we thought of as being the aspirational ideals of our civilizational project. And a lot of that has to do with, if you are a member of the cells that are constitute the liver, don't worry about what the lung has to do. Right? You're a liver cell, do what liver cells do. You don't need to know about what the brain is thinking about. The brain has a few messages to send to you. Hey, you're doing a great job as a liver. Excellent. You know? And I think that in some respects, that's why, you know, first you have the sense of hopelessness on the part of the people who try to make change on the basis of whatever information they got. They participate in the democratic process and they realize, oh, we got completely undermined yet again. So how many generations can you do that over and over again and still have people who are interested in participating? And then you have the interest on the part of leadership where they're like, you know, this democratic process thing is really a pain in the butt for us. It gives us unnecessary friction. Yeah, we understand the people have their wants, but that's really not what makes the world actually function. You know, you people don't really understand what's going on. It takes specialized understanding in order to make this system continue to function. And so it's better if you just entertain yourselves. Just watch the Disney movies. You'll be fine. Will we be fine? I don't think so. You know, I think that this is a very dicey situation. I think that we're likely to have a tremendous amount of turmoil in the near term and perhaps for a very long time. I don't think that the technocrats have it figured out to the extent that they think they have it figured out. Maybe I'm wrong. I have no idea. These are, again, speculative. We're just speculating about it and trying to, because people like you and me are interested in still understanding, right? And in some respects, that's the most annoying thing for the system. Yeah, they have their priests who do that. That's their job. Hopefully, we're providing a useful because there's a vested interest on the part of the people who are paid to do intellectual work, right? And so they're maybe less likely to be really critical, and so therefore they're less likely to point out some of the faults that the system is pursuing. So I think that if the system is truly interested in being functional, they would see critics like, let's say, you and I, as something that's useful for them. It will give them a perspective because we don't have a vested interest in seeing their side of the story. But I think it's important for us to understand their side of the story as much as possible. That's why I'm kind of framing it in these terms.
I like what you're saying, this particular part, and what I'm hearing you say is this analogy with the human body system, right? You have the liver cell that does liver things. You've got the blood cell that does blood things. They're not really related to each other. They're separate. And maybe there's the liver and the lung cells, and they don't need to be particularly aware of what the brain is doing, particularly aware of what what the muscles are doing. But and I see that analogy with sort of the human species right now, as you posit, is that perhaps the reason that we've come to a place in our information landscape where a lot of people are not consuming news and facts and just information about the world they inhabit is because they're liver cells, they are lung cells. They don't need to know about the entire system. And there's a logic in there, I think.
And I think it's important to say that, that's in no way an insult or in any way demeaning their position in the world, because the liver is extraordinarily important, and so is the lung. So, every organ of society, we call it an organ of society, right? Every organ of society has its important role. Even the entertainment world that is apparently producing all this garbage, right? Because, the thing which entertains the liver might be very different from what entertains the lung or the mind.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that that idea, that concept in the first place, I think is very curious, because it makes sense logically. In a system of so many nodes and they're continuing to multiply, we're such a big world. We've grown so quickly in the last couple of decades, especially. We're not used to being this big. It's been a little bit exponential. We're really not used to being this big as a civilization, as a species. And now we're huge. And you look at some of the areas of the world, India, China, certain aspects of the Middle East, you've got so much density. You look at Bangladesh, you look at New Delhi, there's so much density, it's absurd how many we are as a species. And I totally hear you on this analogy of it isn't a surprise that most of the people aren't informed and aren't consuming informative information. It's because it's not their function. They have their own, everyone has their own narrow life, just as you and I do. And we're not responsible for the entire organism. We're just responsible for, our reach. And our reach is so limited. Any person is so limited in their, lifespan, health span, ability, their circumstance, their awareness. They're always so limited. But where I want to maybe, disrupt that vision is, I think there's a desire of, there's a human desire to not be a lung cell. There's almost and I don't know if the more I think about your theory, the more I'm maybe that's the majority of people, and I'm just talking about the minority of people, and maybe that's fine too. But my whole sort of question is, are we lung cells that should just be lung cells, or are we lung cells that want to be human, that want to be the brain, that want to reach further, and we just don't have the access to? Is it that we are limited externally, or that we limit ourselves and are okay with this limitation? To me, it feels like, at least living in the United States, I'm currently based in California, there's a lot of desire for all the lung cells around me to be more than lung cells, to be more than just cells. There's a desire to take greater coverage, take up more space, and take on, to be a larger organism instead of just an organ of an organism. And it makes me think, the chicken or the egg, are we just meant to be limited in the way that we are? Or has there been a conspiracy, a suppression, a mechanism, whatever you want to call, this process where we've become sort of disenfranchised and disconnected from the rest of the organism, but we weren't meant to be? Obviously, I don't know if it's a majority or minority that I'm talking about, but even if it is a minority, there is a group of people that have been sort of left out of the nervous system connection with the rest of the body. And my whole thesis is that it's actually a really big group of people. It's bigger than we think. And we're not just lung cells that are minding someone else's, we're not just lung cells that are minding the brain's business. We are, meant to be in touch and be connected to the entire organism. It's almost like, to take your analogy and say, instead of this is a lung cell that's trying to do a liver's job, it's more like there's a huge part of the body now that has stopped receiving blood and stopped receiving nervous signal. And because of that, that huge part of that part of the body can die, and it may be even urgent. And if that part of the body dies, if your liver and lungs shut down, I'm not sure what happens to the organism. The organism might also suffer and might also die. And so when I think about the information landscape, specific information media landscape, I think of it more as blood and nervous system that connects all these different cells doing different things, where the liver doesn't have to do the lungs' job, but they all must be connected through this system. And when I look at the news media landscape and research it, I spend every day building that universe and that world. I'm seeing a lot of breaks, I'm seeing sort of cancerous activity almost in the system, where all these components are being isolated, are being, echo chambered, polarized, and they're losing touch, which they need to function. And I think that is probably, in my at least view, a more faithful picture of the analogy of like the human organism to the, the civilization's information ecosystems. And yeah, we're getting really passionate about these problems because we only see this exacerbating. We only see the isolation, the polarization, the radicalization, and the disenfranchisement that comes from, cutting off parts of the system. We see that risk increasing substantially, and that de facto actually, exacerbating every year, every month, every day, I would even say. And it's
certainly accelerating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in order for us to have a complete conversation about this, it's going to take several sessions. And I'm perfectly happy to do that if you'd like to do that. I would say one thing that might be worth thinking about is, when was the last time that human beings really were able to stand on their own and survive in the world? I think we have to really think about, how long has this been going on? So there's another interesting evolutionary story that I like to talk about, which is a hypothesis put forth by Lynn Margulis about the ancient world of bacteria. And she believes that at one time there was essentially a single-celled organism that populated the entire planet. So there you have your extraordinarily dense population. And they had produced significant amount of effluence, which is the oxygen that we're now breathing, which was, of course, toxic to them, because that's what effluence is to an organism. And as a consequence, they found themselves ever increasingly exposed to this oxygen. And that's let's say, the evolutionary pressure that produced the development of the eukaryotic cell. The eukaryotic cell, she believes, is comprised of one of these archaic bacteria burrowing into its neighbor to produce a protective barrier. The one that went inside became the mitochondria, right? And then the enclosure of its neighbor became essentially the membrane of the eukaryotic cell. And the mitochondria figured out this intricate mechanism to convert what was previously toxic effluence, the oxygen, into a usable form of energy. Now, I think that civilization is a shorthand way of saying people coming together into large numbers that in order to survive, because conditions had gotten to the point where to survive in smaller groups was becoming increasingly difficult. And okay, we are running out of time because I do not pay money for my Zoom. So we have 10 minutes. Okay, let's see what happens in the next 10 minutes. So, at the same time, the history of the conflict of this kind of, let's say, the interpenetration of different cultural groups, right? That's warfare. That's, in many respects, that's the majority of what is discussed when we talk about history. And so the process that's been happening as a result of our population density has been going on for a very, very long time. Right? That's why you could say, like, the reference to the garden, right? Garden of Eden, is this mythical thing in the past where we didn't have the kinds of pressures that we're now confronted with as a reality of what it means to live in a densely populated species. So, I think that all of us have this aspiration to be free, right? But I know of very few people who can really just go out into the woods and survive. I think maybe I know one person, but I bet even that one person would not survive for long. And so, we have to think very realistically about, what is this yearning for freedom? Is the yearning for freedom something that comes about just because of the demands of the civilization that we live in? Right? And were we to actually experience that freedom, is that something that we'd feel joyful about, or would it be so terrifying that we would end up running back to whatever it is that we could find as a safety place within our civilizational structure that we find so oppressive now? Right? These are just questions, right? That doesn't say that the civilization is going to be functional, right? That doesn't say that there's a happy place necessarily to be found in a civilization that's going through the kind of turmoil that we're going through. Because I think that what we're seeing now is a kind of interpenetration of civilizations, right? That's it's pretty clear that in the globalist vision of what's happening in the world, that this multiculturalism is a big part of the story, and the multiculturalism is producing an incredible amount of difficulty for the, what were formerly called first world nations, So the affluent nations have essentially been interpenetrated by the less affluent nations. And obviously, there will be a variety of, one of the ways of thinking of that is that just like in nature, when there is an evolutionary niche within human social structures, it will be occupied by someone. And so we are really a recapitulation as to what's happening, or what happened within the natural world. We have this incredible diversity of behaviors and activities, and so human beings are profoundly adaptive, and we will occupy niches when they are available. Someone will pick them up. And so, in some respects, I think the question comes back to what we were talking about before. Is there a place for those of us who are not part of the priesthood to play a role in this dialogue that's constructive to ourselves and ideally also constructive to the societies within which we live? That is certainly the set of presumptions that I've made in doing what I'm doing, and I can't speak to whether or not that's going to be effective, but the fact that it resonates with you and that we're having this conversation right now suggests that, okay, well, there is a place for it, and we may as well develop it, because, like I was just saying, human beings will take whatever evolutionary niche there is available to them, and they'll choose the one that they feel the most resonance with if they have that option. And so because we feel a resonance with this evolutionary niche, let's occupy it and see how far it can go. Part of that will be, defining what the niche is, exploring it to the extent that we can, and because the precondition for occupying this niche is a level of honesty that's not popular in other niches, right? We have to be extremely honest about that niche that we're occupying ourselves, not just critical about the dysfunction that we see happening within the system, but also understanding what the parameters are of this niche that we're interested in.
Yeah, I do think that's a helpful reminder as we tend to jump to generalizations about how the world is and how everybody is. It's helpful to remember that we're all parts of a certain niche in this society, in this culture. We're all kind of have our own groups, affiliations, circumstances that bind certain categories of people, bind certain groups of people, and we are not all the same. And whatever effort, my effort with Informed, or even your effort with having these conversations, is always subscribing to a certain category and a subcategory of, we are a collection of niches. We're not one single mass of of people, which also goes back to your previous analogy. We're not all liver cells, and it's silly for a liver cell to try to generalize and think, oh, this is how the world must be for other people. You are a liver cell. You can generalize based on your liver niche. You can't really speak to the experience, the needs, the desires, the ambitions, the frustrations of a brain cell, or of a lung cell, or of any other cell in the greater organism. I think it's a helpful reminder to sort of remind ourselves that we as a society are not a homogeneous item. We are a collection of niches, and we have
here we're bringing into question one of the foundations of democratic liberalism, which is that all men are created equal. They said all men are created equal. You could say all people are created equal is probably the way that most people think of it now. But really, I think you could say, well, only all stem cells are created equal. Right? So we have to face that reality. It's an obvious reality, and it's one that's been avoided in the West. We have an idealism that's very blinding. And it's difficult to get over it because it's a beautiful idea.
Yeah, no, it sure is.
And you could say it was one of the most entertaining ideas, because entertainment means to enter a bind. A chain is a strap that you would use in order to bind things together. So entertainment, it's very similar to the fascism. You want a bunch of people who are different-minded to be bound together. And it's just the best way is just say, we're all equal. We're all the same. We're all human, right? On some level, it's true, right? Because we all have a lung and a liver, and you know what I mean? We all have the same parts, but we're not equal, really, right? We're down to 1 minute, 39 seconds. I wish that I could extend it now, because this is a wonderful conversation, but I'm going to suggest that we pick this up another time, because I have a set of responsibilities that I have to deal with, and am limited on time. But I really appreciate you reaching out. This is a wonderful conversation. I'll release it as soon as I can, and I hope we have an opportunity to pick it up again soon.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Noah. This has been delightful, and it's been fun to speculate on the nature of existence and just, think out loud, intellectualize out loud. This has been really great, and I appreciate this.
Wonderful. Well, we can both meditate on it, take some notes, and we'll have another session sometime soon.
Looking forward.
Me too. Take care, Kira.
Go well, Noah.
Bye-bye.